There's a lot of doubt out there this week. It's sort of interesting, I guess, because I brought it up last week in Easter, that the presence of doubt was in the very Easter story. There's a lot of doubt around this week. One person admitted that they had a hard time getting the Easter story, the resurrection account. Another admitted that there was a problem that was probably too big for them and that they would probably fail in their attempt to overcome it. Another person I talked to doubted the possibility of a second chance in a relationship. It's the end of that relationship. Still another doubted the possibility of work given their age. Another quipped in preparation for this message as I was talking about it with someone about Thomas. They said that they had a hard time believing in the virgin birth. Doubt. Uncertainty. It's in our gospel reading today, and it's at the heart of the Easter story. What a strange place for doubt to show up, isn't it? And with such abundance. I want you to think about those things that you're uncertain of. Those things perhaps that bring doubt. We give Thomas a misnomer, the doubter. Doubting Thomas. Why is it not the best name for Thomas? Well, partly because it's just simply not true. The Greek word that's used that we translate over as doubt is apistos, which is the word for faith with an A at the beginning, so it's like anti-faith, or it's unbelieving. Now, that strikes me as a little bit different than doubting. Unbelief. There's a little more certainty in that, isn't it? I mean, I have doubts about things. I've been pondering the difference between what I doubt and what I unbelieve. Unbelieving, in my mind, speaks of a certain kind of certainty. Doubt acknowledges that there's at least a measure of possibility and certainty, that it's uncertainty about its end result. My kids always want to talk about life on other planets, so I'm a little bit doubtful that there's life on other planets. I think they mean parallel universes. So there's another, Craig Beeker walking around somewhere in some other galaxy. I really am very skeptical about that, and I'm very, very hopeful that I'm skeptical about that. But can I say it's not possible? Am I unbelieving that there is another Craig Beeker walking out there? Yes, I'm unbelieving about that. I'm pretty certain. But I'm a little doubtful about life other places, but it's not ironclad like unbelieving seems to be. Thomas didn't believe the other 10 disciples, and he said he wouldn't believe them. They had an encounter with Jesus on that first Easter Sunday in the evening when the church was gathered together, and they had already begun to hear stories from the fringe of their group, from the women, that Jesus had been risen from the tomb. And if you remember, the other male disciples ran to the tomb and they didn't find anything, but the women had encounters. And that was Sunday night when the church was gathered. But Thomas wasn't there, which should tell you one thing. If you miss church, you might miss something important. You never know who you're going to miss. But Thomas, he wasn't there. I don't know what he was doing. Maybe he was just beginning to get on with his life. But he wouldn't trust their story. Think about the inner dynamics of how that works among the disciples. A shattered community filled with distrust. I can't believe you. I won't believe you. Unless I get the same experience that you have had, I won't believe it. He needed to see the evidence. In fact, he gets very specific about what kind of evidence he wants to have and what he wants to do with that evidence. He just wants to be given the same opportunity that the other disciples were given. And as you see in our passage for today, Jesus showed them immediately on that first resurrection appearance his hands. And they saw and believed. When you read through the resurrection accounts of all four Gospels, you quickly realize that Thomas is not alone in his doubt or his uncertainty or his lack of faith. In fact, doubt doesn't seem to be the exception. Doubt seems to be the rule. No one, even after all the predictions, no one says to Jesus when he finally shows up, "Oh, where you been? What took you so long to get here?" No one did that. Even though Jesus told them over and over again what was going to happen, no one predicted it. No one understood. When he finally shows up, everyone seems to be filled with surprise and doubt. Everyone. Which leads me to believe that there's something about doubt that's important to faith. Maybe even essential to faith. That doubt maybe even is a special kind of faith. Perhaps doubt is the kind of faith that allows possibilities to exist that we hadn't counted on or had predicted. In fact, I think it's a disservice of the church, particularly a disservice of the church in the modern era, where we made faith something very simple. We tried to make it into 3 steps, and if it went along with alphabetical things, that would be great. A, B, C. We tried to simplify it in such a way as to nail it all down. And so there was very little wiggle room for mystery. We oversimplified it. And everyone struggles with that when you engage the mystery. Everybody carries in their hearts and in their minds doubts and uncertainties about all sorts of things, let alone the things that we're talking about in the gospel today. And this, in turn, seems to shape the faith of Thomas. And I think the words that I hear about Thomas, when I was younger, particularly in the modern era church, I heard these words, "Do you believe because you've seen? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe." In the modern era, I used to hear that as a rebuking of Thomas, as if somehow his doubts and his uncertainties were a bad thing. I'm not quite sure that that's why that was there. Now, I think Jesus is blessing all of those, like you and me, and the whole church today, who haven't been given an opportunity to examine the physical evidence of it, but have gone on faith on the word of others who saw the evidence. And that we, though we haven't had a direct experience of him, believe despite our doubts and our uncertainty. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe. That's you and me. Jesus is blessing forward all those who hear this story and sight unseen, believe it, and act upon it. I think the greatest marvel, of course, of Easter is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead to eternal life. But a subplot in that, and one of the major themes running through all the Gospels, is also the amazing fact that the disciples don't hide their doubt. They're pretty open about it. In fact, if you've ever noticed, it's almost all the resurrection appearances, there's some kind of question in them. Is this him or not? We don't really want to ask because we don't want to get in trouble. But we're questioning until he does something familiar, until they see the signs, maybe the stars like Thomas asked for, or a familiar sign, and then a world begins to open up to them, and they fall to their knees like Thomas and claim him, my Lord and my God. But what's equally fascinating about it is that in their doubt, in their uncertainty, Christ can claim them. It doesn't require perfect faith. I wonder if that's not how God designed us. I mean, I look at sort of evolutionary biology, and what sets us apart from almost all other animals is the tenacity of our curiosity. It's not enough just to explore the planet. We had to blast off in a rocket filled with gasoline, well, jet fuel, and go out into other planets to figure it out. We don't see that impetus among any other creature on the planet. Our curiosity is burning. It seems to be something seated within us. We want to know now more, and doubt seems to be a special kind of faith. And maybe we need to be encouraged in it. One of my favorite authors the Christian authors is Craig Beeker, who writes finally, he says, finally, all we really have is holy insecurity. That's not very comforting for those of us who still like to nail things down, and yet allows for that possibility that God's doing something. Faith is not certain. Stepping out in trust without knowing what's going to happen for sure is what faith is all about. I appreciate the mystics on this behalf. St. John of the Cross said that God has to work in the soul in secret and in darkness. Now listen to this. God has to work in your soul in secret and in darkness, because if we fully knew what was happening, what God or grace or the mystery will eventually ask of us, we would either try to take charge of it or we'd stop the process altogether. Isn't that fascinating? God has to work sort of in the fissures that are created by our doubts, in those fracture lines, that the grace flows through those things, because that's how grace gets into us sometimes. In our certainty, we lock ourselves out. Listen to the certainty that Thomas has. I will not believe unless I see and put my hands. That's not doubt. That's certainty. He's not going to believe. And yet it's going to be the fissures of his doubt into which Christ pours his grace until finally he's on his knees. And we know the end of the story, right? Thomas was the one by legend went to India. We lost track of Thomas. He just sort of disappears. He's one of the disciples that just simply disappears. The rumor was, legend had it, that he disappeared into India. Some 400 years later, the church finally ends up in India in a missionary appeal, and they find these Thomist Christians. Acting on such doubt, he goes where no one had ever gone before with the message of God's grace, and his community forms around him, and he blesses those who have not seen with the grace that is unseen. There's some purpose, I think, for the overwhelming presence of doubting in our Easter stories. And I challenge you to read the stories and pick out all the experiences of doubting or uncertainty that seems to be there right in the middle of our Easter stories. Written right into the middle of the Gospels, right at the very end, when you think they'd be brought to a crescendo, we get this story, and then the end cap. We can't tell you all the stories, John includes his Gospel, but we have told you these ones so that you, though not seeing, might come to believe. Perhaps we don't need to have it all figured out before hanging out with the church. Perhaps we don't have to have it all figured out before we would help out a neighbor or feed someone who's hungry or caring for someone that's in need. If we have to figure it all out ahead of time, I would think that, like the mystics, John the Cross said, we would probably stop that endeavor altogether, because we would start thinking about whether or not it was abused or used in an appropriate way. Frankly, don't you ever wonder if your kindness, if your caring really makes a difference? I mean, there are so many hungry people in the world. How can the few that I touch really change things? Now, I believe that it does, but the doubt creeps in, doesn't it? The guy standing on the corner, what's some of our first thoughts? Doubt. I don't want to give him cash because he'll probably use it for booze. What is that? Uncertainty. Doubt. Should I extend this hand or this listening ear? Does it really make a difference in anyone's life? Is there any transformative change happening? You can hear the doubt. But I believe it does make a difference, even at times if it causes us to wonder and to doubt. And yet, because we are Easter people and we believe as well as doubt, believing in this more fragile way, we act, we reach out, we feed, we care, we tend, we struggle, we love, we work without any guarantees, just a promise from the Lord who continues to bless those who will continue to work even amidst their doubts and their faith. You notice, though Thomas couldn't and wouldn't believe, he kept right on showing up with those other crazies who seemed to have drunk the Kool-Aid. He kept showing up with them. He kept coming back. And finally, he could believe. God bless Thomas in this story. I worry that for so many years I heard sermon after sermon sort of pointing out Thomas's bad behavior and saying, don't do that. But I think the story resides here because that's who we are. That's written into our stories. That we too, like Thomas, struggle to believe and yet believe. Struggle to hold hope and yet hold hope. Live in a world that's shattered and yet believe in a world that's unbroken because of Easter. We live in a world where we continue to bury our dead, and yet we would boldly proclaim, He is risen!
He is risen indeed.
Or half boldly. Perhaps we good church folks need to entertain our doubts more often. Can I say that? Anybody getting ready to run from the room, report me to the bishop? I'll give you his phone number. Maybe we can see these things as a part of our pilgrimage, as pilgrim partners with us, as a strange but different kind of faith. And the outcome of that might be a greater openness to the doubters around us. I think we definitely have to figure that out. Because the world has marched off from the modern church, which nailed everything down, and they are highly skeptical. Your children, the children of this congregation, are exceedingly skeptical about those easy answers that we came up with. And they struggle with the church and have a hard time showing up again in the upper room because they don't understand how we can believe some of the things we do, and they just don't seem to line up. I think one of the turnoffs to the church today is that we seem to demand intellectual assent to all these propositions. Everybody seems to believe it, I think people think, but we know it isn't so. One preacher this week, David Lowe's from Luther Seminary, encouraged us to take index cards and pass them out to the congregation and do a collection, not of faith, but of doubts. I don't have the courage to do that. I didn't do it. But I think the outcome of that sort of thing is that we become a little more honest and perhaps a lot more engaging to those beyond the church. I mean, we probably should just get all the skeletons out of the closet. I mean, there are more than a few of us who have serious questions and plaguing doubts and disappointments with God and hurts from the church, and still you're here. Imagine it. Still casting your vote with Thomas, who keeps showing up in the upper room, who, unbelieving and doubting, knew that community was the place to be, even if he fully didn't understand why. So what are your doubts? What are your questions? What kind of agnosticism or atheism or ants in the pants sort of faith are you living with today? I want to bless your doubts. How about that? Bless them as a special kind of faith. Second, I want to bless you and your faith amid your doubts. And lastly, I want to bless you and ask you to bring out these doubts as you work as Easter people in our world by bringing hope to those who you encounter who themselves encounter Easter and its cacophony of meaningless and meaningful things, Easter bunnies and resurrected people. And as we encounter them with genuineness, perhaps they too will be attracted by our vulnerability in the story. I just can't believe you, Thomas said. But by the end, through the encouragement of the community and the presence of Christ he found therein, he kneels and says, "My Lord and my God." As you go, remember that the risen is strong enough to bear your faith. He's strong enough equally to bear your doubt. That's one of the messages I hear in the Gospels that includes so many uncertain endings and so much doubt, is that Christ keeps coming to them. He keeps choosing them. He keeps showing himself to them. He keeps revealing himself in the breaking of bread, in the story of their word, and bringing it alive within them until finally they can believe. Who knows, maybe a week or 3 down the road, the question that you hold in your heart will be answered. Or maybe not. Perhaps God will use your faith in your doubts to bless another in their faith or in their doubt. And such genuineness of faith will appeal to them. And the community of faith will be the place where they start showing up. The point of being faithful Easter people isn't living beyond doubts or not having any doubts whatsoever, but living with faith in the midst of these doubts. Today, Thomas is honest and real about his struggle. And in it, he gets a greater gift of God's presence, of Christ's presence in the midst of the church. Let me close it by quoting a poem about persisting in doubt and faith and being given the greater gift of Christ himself. This is by somebody who wrote this more than 150 years ago, A.B. Simpson, no relation to Homer Simpson. He wrote, Once it was the blessing. Now it is the Lord. Once it was the feeling. Now it is His Word. Once His gifts I wanted. Now the giver owned. Once I sought the healing. Now Himself alone. Once it was my working. His it hence shall be. Once I tried to use Him. Now He uses me. Once the power I wanted. Now the mighty one. Once for self I labored. Now for Him alone. I hope you'll keep coming back, as they say in a number of meetings in this particular room, because in those meetings they're honest about their doubts and uncertainty. And I would hope it would affect this room, that we too could live with our doubts and uncertainty, and in the midst of it, find Himself present to us, so that somewhere kneeling in the midst of that cacophony of faith and doubt, we too could kneel with Thomas and say with him a bold acclamation of faith, my Lord and my God. He is risen.
He is risen indeed. Hallelujah.